Today, we are continuing to make our way through building the nutrient management plan and headed into the third week. So, hopefully, people are keeping up with the homework. I know last week was a big week trying to get all the fields um, into the into the plan. Depending on how many fields you have, that can be really time consuming. Um, and just takes a little time to get everything in there. So last week again we talked about phosphorus and the phosphorus index and using the index as a way to predict potential phosphorus losses from fields on farms. That is, again, an important tool in nutrient management that is, really used to help manage any potential losses. And also, learning about how to minimize buildup in the soils. That's an important component. We certainly don't want to get soils that are so excessive in phosphorus that it becomes very difficult to manage them environmentally, but also agronomically. Oh, I see Sarah is on. So that's great. Um, hopefully, hopefully they're on. Sarah, is Newport? We're just getting started. I just want to make sure you guys are
Yeah, we're good.
okay. Perfect.
Yeah. We were waiting on one person,
Okay.
but I imagine she'll trickle in here.
Yeah, and we'll just get kind of started slow here. All right, so everybody got their homework last week. Like I said, hopefully you were able to get your way through that. That's a big part of the class is just entering the fields, and so getting those populated and go crop again is a really big lift. Today, we're going to talk about nitrogen and the nitrogen cycle and kind of where that plugs in to go crop and to nutrient management. For your homework this week, there's a couple of distinct pieces that we're going to need to work on. So, one piece is uploading or entering the manure storage production quantity and quality for the farm. So, this is information that should be generated for you that essentially helps to determine the amount of manure and other wastes. Obviously, sometimes there's wastewater, gray water, bedding, things like that, that will go in, waste feed that will go into a manure storage. So, calculating the amount of manure and other waste that are being produced on the farm. And those wastes are held in some kind of storage generally, but sometimes they're also in stacks or piles um, out, in fields or in maybe in a holding area. But we need to know how much manure and other wastes are being produced on the farm. Okay. And again, that number should be generated for you, obviously, with information you've provided to the planner that you're working with. So you should have a quantity. And that quantity might be in tons per acre, it might be, or I'm sorry, in tons, or it might be in gallons, but we'll be entering that information into the plan. Because remember, we're going to take what you're producing on the farm for nutrients. So we need to know how much that is roughly. And then the other piece we need to know is what's in it. So one of the requirements of a nutrient management plan is to have that manure source tested each year. So the requirement is for one test to evaluate the nutrient content of what's being held in that storage of the manure and other waste. Okay, so again, we can't do a very good job of determining, what kind of nutrient resources you have on your farm if we don't know how much, and what's in it. So the requirements again are to have a nutrient or manure test for every individual storage on your farm, because likely it's going to be different. So again, it's one test. You can see the probably pros and cons of only having one test, right? Like a pro would be, well, you only got to do it once. You only got to pay $30 or whatever the cost is now. The downside of that also, of course, is it's one test, one point in time. And I think, people probably realize that in a manure storage, depending on when you take the sample, what time of year, how much rainfall we've had, all of those factors will influence the nutrient content. So you want to be mindful of when you take the sample, and you want to make sure you do a good job taking it, because you are basing your, a large part of your nutrient management plan on those numbers. Okay. And taking samples every year also starts to give you a bigger view of what, what that storage looks like, what the nutrient values are year in and year out. And, barring major shifts in weather, which we do see, those numbers tend to be somewhat consistent, actually, if the test is taken the same way, around the same time. So over time, you can kind of build your own book value, really, and you can use that, and we'll talk about that more. But most people just honestly have a hard time of getting a manure sample once a year. But again, it's really important. It's the basis, really, of your whole plan. Like, how do you take this quantity and quality of nutrients on your farm and feed your crops with it? So, it's a critical piece of the whole program. So you want to do as good a job as you can to get that information. Okay, so we're going to be plugging that into the nutrient management plan today. And then the other thing we're going to be entering into the plan is the equipment that you use to spread the manure. So even if you're hiring a custom operator, putting in the size and types of spreaders that they use will help you when you're keeping records. So we will have you enter that information as well. And then finally, the last piece of your homework will be to enter in the crop information for your field. So you're going to enter in the crop, what crop you're growing, some information about that crop, and then you're also going to enter in the crop rotation for that field. And remembering, some people don't have rotations, right? Some people have permanent hay or permanent pasture. And so the amount of time it'll take you to enter this information in will vary depending on, the type of farm that you have. So another big lift this week is getting the crops in to go crop, the rotations, and all the information that goes into that. So that's what's in store for this week. And Lindsay will get on here and show you how to do that in Go Crop after we talk about nitrogen. Let's talk about nitrogen. Oh, you guys don't look as excited as I thought you would be about talking about nitrogen. And I laugh because I can't even see any of you. I only see Newport. So thank you, Newport, for showing us your beautiful faces there. It's actually really nice to see somebody. I also, I see, Brendan, that you're on, and I want to take a minute to introduce you. I don't know. There you are. Hey, Brendan.
Yeah, hi.
I did get your email. And
Oh, perfect.
yeah, I wanted to make sure we had a chance to introduce you to folks in the NMP class because some of them are up in your neck of the woods. And so Brendan is the new extension agronomy specialist up in St. J. So Brendan, I don't know if you want to take a second, introduce yourself, and I don't know, little intro, pump everybody up.
Yeah, no, sure. Yeah. My name is Brendan Noons. Yeah, my office is in St. Johnsbury as the new agronomy specialist with UVM Extension, but my kind of area of service is the entire Connecticut River watershed. So basically, the entire eastern half of the state is where I'll be working. Um, yeah, no, this NMP class is great because we're going to be doing some NMP update sessions with Carly Bass, kind of going doing one I think in Newport and then White River and then one other location in the next month and a half or so. So this is a great bringing up to date so that I can help farmers uh, get their nutrient management plans up to date and everything. Um,
Great.
yeah.
Well, welcome, and hopefully we will meet up in person soon. But just wanted to let others know that you're here and hitting the ground running. So,
No, I appreciate
um,
that. Thank you.
yeah. All right. Okay. So let's talk about nitrogen. Like I said today, um, and then let me just I gotta get that on my screen, and then we'll get into go crop. But nitrogen, that's a fun one, I will say. It is a complicated, complex nutrient, far more complicated than any of the others. Um, it is a shapeshifter. If you're into that kind of thing, it can move from one form to another. It can be available, it can not be available, it can be lost to the air, lost to the ground. It's heavily driven by the biology in your soil. And actually, some people would say that nitrogen itself is 100% biologically driven, which is, makes it more difficult to control and manage. It makes it very, very different than any of the other nutrients. And this, my friends, is why you don't see an actual nitrogen number on your soil test. People always ask me that, well, why don't we see a number for nitrogen? You get a recommendation, but you don't actually see a value there, like so many parts per million of nitrogen in the soil. And the reason for that is that, like I said, it's a shapeshifter. It moves so quickly from form to form. It can be lost very quickly in the soil, here today, gone tomorrow. So it's hard to capture um, in time, right? So we could put a number on your soil test, but it would not be reliable at all. So we don't. So we have to use other tools and other types of predictions to try to the best of our capabilities to help you understand how much nitrogen is there for your crop. But it's difficult to manage. Okay, so let's dig into that a little bit. So we know how important nitrogen is. You know, it's the building block of amino acids and proteins and nucleic acids, and it drives a lot of function in the plants, in us, in our livestock. It's very, very important nutrient. It's essential. You know that. Um, Now, interestingly, nitrogen tends to be the most limiting nutrient in agricultural production systems, right? Most farms have to add nitrogen annually, and most farms have to add quite a lot of it to grow the crops that they're growing. It's a constant battle. Now, this is interesting because there's a lot of nitrogen available. There's so much around us. The air that we breathe is mostly N2 gas. So it's kind of frustrating that, just breathing it in, but yet our crops can't access that. And so as a result, they tend to struggle to get enough nitrogen. So a lot of N2 gas in the air, but the plants themselves can't access that N2 gas directly. Remember, last week we talked about the two forms of nitrogen that plants can take up, and N2 gas was not one of them, right? It was NO3 minus nitrates and NH4 plus ammonium. That's it. And so how do we get that N2 gas out of the air and make that available to our crops? All right, so this gas, this N2 gas, is actually two nitrogens stuck together by a triple bond. You might remember that from science class, long time ago, chemistry class. But that triple bond means it's hard to get those two apart. It's really hard to break. And there's two ways that that bond gets broken so that we can get nitrogen into the forms that our plants can use. So there are microorganisms, and this is, what I was saying, this is a biologically driven nutrient. There are a few organisms that we can't see that can break this bond and directly use that nitrogen. Amazing, right? This tiny, tiny thing we can't even see can break that triple bond, but plants, us, we can't do that same thing. But there is a way, there's a pathway, and we'll talk more about those microorganisms. Now, the other way, and I would say at this point, this is the predominant way that most crops, most plants, even people, get protein and nitrogen. And it's through the Haber-Bosch process, which essentially takes nitrogen gas out of the air and then uses hydrogen from natural gas and water to break that triple bond and make ammonia. And I think some people know the historical, sort of history behind the Haber-Bosch process. But, really what came of it, even though it was developed for making bombs, what really came of this was nitrogen fertilizers. And probably the biggest use, obviously, the Haber-Bosch process today is to make nitrogen fertilizers for food production. And, we know, I guess, because of the process, it's super energy intensive. And it takes a lot of energy to make synthetic nitrogen. And as energy costs go up, the cost of nitrogen fertilizers go up. So they're tied hand in hand. And so what we want to make sure that people, again, are doing in this class to minimize the amount of purchased nitrogen, because it is very costly, and that cost goes up and down based on energy prices, is utilize the power of the microbe on your farm. So you can actually, microbe farm and make your own nitrogen. That's kind of cool, right? And then, of course, you're recycling plant nitrogen through your cows, and that's coming to you in the form, the nitrogen's coming to you in the form of manure, waste. Okay, so we want to utilize those things first, again, so we reduce the costly input of nitrogen through the Haber-Bosch process. All right, so remember when we saw the phosphorus cycle? You probably don't even remember. It's boring. I talked about it for about 2 minutes. There's two lines. It's available or it's tied up. It comes from manure and rocks. But otherwise, it's a pretty straightforward process. Nitrogen, not so much. You can see lots of arrows here, lots of different forms of nitrogen coming from different places. Lots going on here. And again, there's a lot of losses that can be seen in the system. So you can see these arrows, basically nitrogen being lost into the air, nitrogen being consumed by plants, nitrogen being lost into water through leaching and runoff. So there's lots of pathways here to lose nitrogen, and that's what we're trying to minimize. And we're trying to maximize how much nitrogen makes its way up into plants and ultimately into animals. All right, so let's talk about the microbes again. How do we take the nitrogen gas out of the air and nitrogen that's found in manure, decomposing organic matter, and get that available to our crops in those two forms? And really, that is biology, biology, biology. So you've got to have a very active, um, biological soil, right? Lots of different organisms to make this happen and to make it happen quickly and efficiently. Um, you need biology. Okay, so again, to get the ammonium and the nitrate, generally that is coming, from the breakdown of organic matter and the release of these plant available nitrogen forms. Plants they really like nitrates. I guess to put it simply, they're easier to digest. um, Ammonium itself, when a plant takes it up, it's a little bit, I don't want to say it's toxic, but it's harder for them to utilize. They actually need to expend energy, and get rid of some of the hydrogens on that nitrogen molecule to be able to utilize it. So they do prefer nitrates. All right, so how do we get those? A lot of the nutrient, again, a lot of the nitrogen we have available to us is in the form of manure, and then also legumes. So, or plow down crop residues, like in a hay field or a cover crop. Okay, so you have the nitrogen that's embodied in those plants, or the nitrogen that's in the manure, and we call this organic N. Okay. And what this means is that you have nitrogen stuck to carbon, and your plants cannot utilize that. They cannot suck up a piece of manure and get the nitrogen off of it themselves. Okay. So we need soil microbes to actually do that work for us. And those soil microbes will utilize the carbon and the nitrogen, and produce some byproducts that are highly valuable to our plants and to us. Okay. Now, in order for this process to happen, right, for microbes, and these are general microbes, right? This is all kinds of things in your soil, from the action of worms, um, the action of ground beetles, to fungi, to bacteria. So it's a very collaborative process, I would say, these microbes breaking down this organic matter. Now, they do need you to tend to them. They are there, they're doing their job, but they can do it better when the ground temperature is warmer. So microbes are most active as the soil temperature begins to rise. Really, probably similar to us. They sort of like it warm, but a little bit cool, 65-ish, 70. They're really, really raring, really active. If it gets too cold, they totally shut down. They don't die, but they go dormant, like what's happening right now, basically, usually below 50 degrees. And then when it hits, in the 90s in the soil, which it does, and you want to watch for that, they also shut down. Okay, so keeping the soil temperature moderated is very helpful, especially in the summer, to keep microbes going. But I think a lot of people notice, like slow microbial activity in the spring. When you see things sometimes when it's cold, in the spring, you'll see, let's say the corn has come up. It's kind of a cold May, early June, and you see that corn looks kind of pale green. You put enough manure on. Oh, you even put fertilizer on, but the crop's not greening up. And then all of a sudden it starts to warm up and everything sort of looks that nice bright green. And again, that has to do with microbes starting to break down organic nitrogen and making it available to your plant. Okay, so besides it needing to be, warm in the ground, microbes also need air. They need oxygen, the ones that we want for this process. They need adequate moisture, not too much, not too little, because again, they'll go dormant. So they need a nice home, right? They need good soil structure that's going to retain ample air, decent amount of moisture, and allow the soil to warm up. So, they're kind of asking a lot here, but really what we're looking at is building, good soil health so the microbes can be active. Okay. Um, let's talk about immobilization, which is sort of the backwards equation of mineralization. Okay, so mineralization microbes are utilizing the carbon and the nitrogen on the organic matter, and they're breaking it down, and there's some excess, so that's being released to your plants. Now, the opposite can actually happen, and I'll give you an example of this, where the organic matter that you've added to the field has a lot of carbon and not very much nitrogen. So an example of that would be like a sawdust bedded calf hutch, or horse manure tends to have a lot of carbon in it. Okay, so you go out and you put that sawdust bedded manure, and there's a lot of bedding and some pee and poop in there, but not as much as there is sawdust. And you go and you put that on the field. What you're going to see is you're going to see whatever's trying to grow there again go yellow, or maybe not grow very well at all. And what's happening is that the microbes really want to break down that organic matter, but there's not enough nitrogen to break it down. So they'll actually start pulling any available nitrogen, any available ammonium or nitrate out of the soil, okay, and use that to try to then break down the organic matter you just added. Now, eventually, it will get kind of recycled around, but in the short term, it can cause what we say like nitrogen tie up in the soil. So just something to be aware of. And maybe you've experienced this, but you have to be careful about some of the organic material that you have on your farm. And if you have something that has a lot of sawdust in it or a lot of hay or straw, you might wait and put that on the ground months prior, sometimes fall applied material, so that it has time to break down and not harm your crops. Okay, so I did say that crops like nitrates better, and in the soil, that ammonium nitrogen, which the plants will take up to, does get converted to nitrates, and it can be converted quite quickly. Now, one thing I want to note here is that the ammonia has this NH4 plus, okay, and nitrates have a NO3 minus. Now, if you remember this long drawn out presentation last week, we talked about cation exchange capacity, and we talked about charge on your soil. And so the soil has negative charge. So the soil can actually hold on to this ammonium, but the soil cannot necessarily hold on to the nitrates. So although the plants like this, they're also a bit easier to lose because they're not going on to those exchange sites like the ammonium. Nonetheless, it's happening, and this process is driven by soil bacteria. And there's two bacteria, very specific. So organic nitrogen, mineralization to ammonium nitrogen, all kinds of microbes, ammonium nitrogen to nitrates, two very specific bacteria that make this whole process happen. And without them, we don't see this conversion. Now, if you have bought nitrogen inhibitors for your farm, some of these nitrogen inhibitors, depending on the type and brand or whatever, their active ingredient is, sometimes those nitrogen, if it's a nitrification inhibitor, what it's doing is it's slowing down these bacteria. Okay. And it's keeping the nitrogen in the ammonium form. So these bacteria, again, they can be manipulated in the soil through these additives, but in general, you want them working, you want them efficient. So, they have requirements, and we talked about most of those already, but one requirement in particular is that they do like a pH that's near neutral. And I talked about this last week when we talked about pH for a long period of time, that we want the pH on that slightly acidic to more neutral end. And that's important to the plant's nutrient availability, but also to microbes. Okay, so denitrification. So we have nitrification, which is ammonium to nitrates, but then we have denitrification. And that is the conversion of ammonium to N2 gas or N2O, nitrous oxide. Now that may sound sort of familiar, this nitrous oxide, because that is one of the most potent greenhouse gases that we hear a lot about, right? We hear about greenhouse gases and greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. One of the emissions that is predominant often in agriculture is nitrous oxide, so N2O. And N2O can be formed in other ways, but a predominant way that it's formed in agriculture is, again, through the conversion of ammonium by bacteria to nitrous oxide. And what's interesting about this is that it is specific to situations where there's no oxygen. Okay. And that's because these bacteria are anaerobes and they are active when there's no oxygen. So we see a lot of denitrification occur in soils when they are saturated with water. So in wet springs, right? So you can always have some level of soil saturation. You have these like little microsites, but we will see significant loss to this pathway in years where we have very saturated soils, especially when it's warm, and there's nitrogen sources that are plentiful. And, I think of 2023, 2024, and the spring of 2025, where we had a lot of rainfall, soils were saturated, and we likely lost, especially in heavier soils, nitrogen to this pathway. All right, so another part of the process, which is certainly agriculturally significant, is loss of nitrogen through volatilization. And hopefully, or I'm sure most of you have heard of this, which is essentially when ammonium nitrogen is lost into the air in the gas form. So NH4 plus is converted to NH3, which is a gas. And this is very, very common. And we actually will sort of calculate for these losses in your NMP. Anytime you put manure on the surface of the soil or any kind of ammonium-based fertilizer, it's at risk of being lost to volatilization. Okay, so that if NH4 is applied to the surface, and it mixes with air essentially, it can be lost quite rapidly. And so that's something we hear about a lot, especially when we're applying nitrogen fertilizers during the summertime. So we see the highest losses um, when we have warm conditions and wet soils, and then let's say high wind. Okay. So you put out fertilizer, the soil's relatively moist, or maybe it rains, and then all of a sudden, it gets hot, sunny, windy. That's when we see this quick loss of nitrogen. And honestly, with both manure and nitrogen fertilizers, the losses are significant. Under the right conditions, it can be 60, 80% of the nitrogen being lost. So we want to make sure we protect those nutrients. And NH3 is not nitrous oxide per se, but it's still a gas loss into the environment. It's still an economic loss for the farm. Okay, so again, all of this process you can see is driven by biology. We want to make sure we're taking care of the biology so that that is an efficient process. And also, you're optimizing it for your farm. So again, we're looking for air space, water space, and plenty of room for the microbes to live and grow, and break down that organic matter. So soil structure itself is critical in enhancing and driving the biological activity in your soil. And it's something I don't think a lot of people really think about. We've been hearing a lot lately about compaction of soils, especially under the severe wet conditions that we've had over the last couple of years. And we keep hearing soils are compacted, soils are compacted. And oftentimes you can visually see, in a hay field, where, like, let's say a manure spreader has driven, right, when it was wet, and you can see the tire tracks in those hay fields, a week later, where around it you've got all this grass growing, green and lush, but where those tire tracks are, it's like yellow, and you can see it, the grass isn't growing as well. And again, that part of the field where those tires went over got compacted, right? And so what does that mean? Essentially, the soil's been compressed. And when the soil gets compressed, right, what is driven out of the soil? The air, right? So to the right here, you can see a soil that we call well aggregated. And you can see these little particles. They look like little rocks. They're all different sizes. You can see they don't sit on top of each other very nicely. And because of that, you can see there's space. There's space between these, like, soil aggregates is what we call them. And that's how the air and the water move down through your soil. Okay. That's how it should move down through your soil. And it also, very importantly, creates room for root growth. So you can see the roots can kind of navigate all the way through those soil aggregates. And in those aggregates, you have the soil water, which we heard before. It's the soil water that has the nutrients in it that the plant roots will be able to take up and utilize, right? But plants also need oxygen, and that's where they're getting it also out of the soil air. Okay, so to the right here, this is essential to crop productivity and also biological activity. Okay, now to the left is a completely different situation. One that also is very common, especially common after these really wet years, where you can see there's none of these little aggregates, right? They're not there. And you can see this sort of crust on the top of the soil. I'm sure many of you have seen this out in the fields. And you see this poor little unthrifty plant that can barely get up through that crust, trying very hard to emerge. You can see its plant root is having kind of a hard time getting down through the soil that's just um, loose or not loose, but not aggregated. And then you see the difficulty clearly of air getting down into the soil as well, and then also water. Okay, so this is where we start to see lots of issues with runoff, right? Because if water is hitting the top of the soil and it can't go down, it's going to start moving across, right? And so, in years again where we have a lot of rainfall and we have soils that are not well aggregated already, we tend to see a lot of runoff, a lot of erosion, all the things we don't want to see, right? And then we see plants that are very unthrifty, not able to grow, not able to access nutrients because there's no air, there's no water, and the biology is severely limited. So our goal here, and why we're talking about this, I mean, this is critical to success on farms, is that we want to create soils like we're seeing here on the right, okay? And we want to avoid what we're seeing on the left. So how do we do that? And a lot of these little PEDs, little aggregates, they're formed through the biology, right? The biological activity glues the dispersed soil particles together. And that's the simplest way to put it. You have soil particles, right? You have sand, you have silt, you have clay, and they're individual entities. And if you want them to lay on top of each other, like you saw in the one picture, this is especially true in clay, then get rid of biology, okay? You need the biology to stick those soil particles together to make these aggregates. And these aggregates are what kind of form this really nice physical structure of your soil. So having that biological activity, feeding it, right? You add organic matter. We're pretty good at that, especially farms that are adding manure regularly. So you're giving them something to eat, you're getting them going. And then you need to create an opportunity for them to create aggregates, okay, and form a soil that has this really nice, chaotic structure. And when we have that kind of structure, okay, that's when we get infiltration of water, not runoff. So this is really important. We want this aggregated structure to protect water quality, to protect our investment as farmers, which is our topsoil, and to support the healthy, productive growth of plants and the crops that we grow and the animals that we feed on our farm. So, creating this type of physical structure on the soil is all linked, right, to biology, nutrient management, and how we manage our crops and soils. That crust that you often see on the top of soil, especially after it rains, right, and then when it dries, you start to see it break up. That's caused by the physical force of raindrops smashing the aggregates that were once there, right? Dispersing them so that now they're just particles. And then when the sun comes out, it dries. And then it makes it very difficult then for water and air to get down into the ground. Okay, here's a non cartoon picture of what this looks like in Vermont. And you can see here the bigger picture in the background, that's a clay soil, predominantly clay. It's a heavy clay soil. after a significant rain event. Um, and you can see the smashing of those aggregates, right? You can see this sort of smearing on the top of the soil. You don't see any, little peds here. And then we know what's going to happen, right? The ground, the sun's going to come up. Actually, you still see water over here to the left that couldn't make it down into the ground. Can't get down through that. Now there's no space. So now it's going to get sunny, and that surface is going to bake like a crust. It's going to still be wet underneath, right? And then the farmer's going to have to wait a lot longer for that ground to dry out. And this is very costly. To the right here, you can see actually, it looks like a completely different soil, but this was on the opposite side of the fence, believe it or not. It is the uh, same soil type, managed very, very differently. This field to the left in the background was in a continuous row crop. And this field here was in a rotation, in a sod rotation. It was actually its first year out of hay into corn. And what I want you to notice is this was literally within maybe an hour, taking both of these pictures. What you can see here is the soil started to dry out, right? You can see the surface is actually drying. You can still see the crumbles, the peds, the aggregates. They withstood the rainstorm, and you don't see any standing water there. And you know that that soil is going to dry out. And I don't know if anybody else has ever experienced this, but have you ever heard water um, percolating down through the soil? It's like you can almost hear it. You can hear it draining, like gurgling, kind of. And that's what you could actually hear in this soil was the water kind of gurgling down, I guess, through all the pore space. But this is what we have to get to in Vermont. When we're talking about, oh, we got to build healthy soils to be climate resilient, to resist the type of rainstorms we're having today, this is what we're talking about. Okay. This helps, maintain the biology, the productivity of the plants, and the quality of the water. So we have to get ourselves here and away from this. Some people will say, well, how do I get those aggregates? And one of there's many things, right, we can do. So we got to feed the biology, which again, we're generally fairly good at in Vermont. We have high organic matter soils. We have a long history of, applying manure on a lot of fields. But one thing that destroys soil structure is constant um, tillage. And so, reducing the amount of tillage that we have in our system can help, or the years between tillage. So, having a rotation that includes sod forming plants for many years, and then several years of tillage, um, reducing the, abrasiveness of the tillage we're using, making sure that we're have plant roots growing in the ground all the time, which is why we promote cover crops, right? We don't want bare soils. So there's a lot of things that we are doing, and things we probably need to do a bit better. But this is what we're trying to achieve. Okay. So how do we lose nitrogen? We talked about this a little bit. We lose nitrogen into the air, right? So volatilization, denitrification, um, and we can lose nitrogen into surface water through runoff, right? So, and then we can also lose nitrogen into the groundwater through nitrates. And so I mentioned nitrates have a negative charge. They don't glom onto the soil, so they're more prone to loss. And this is generally how we end up seeing nitrates in groundwater. So we have to really manage nitrogen again to really be timed with plant growth. Another good reason to have cover crops in the winter time or in those off seasons, because it can take up excess nitrogen that would otherwise, be likely be lost into the environment. All right. So just to revisit this cycle here, again, like I said, it's complicated. We just went through the whole thing, a lot going on there. But we have nitrogen gas gets into plants, right? Through legumes primarily, but also through fertilizer. Animals eat the plants. They produce manure. Plant residues and the manure gives us the organic matter that will have our microbes break down and make that nitrogen available to our crops. So that's called mineralization. And then this ammonium nitrogen can be utilized by plants, but most of it will be converted to nitrates through the process of nitrification. It can also be lost in runoff, of course. The nitrates themselves hopefully will be taken up by the plants, which is why we want to always have some kind of plant roots growing, or it can also be lost through denitrification or into the groundwater like we talked about. So again, all of this is biology at work. It's hard to manage, a lot of things going on here, but we do our best by creating a healthy soil to optimize the biology, keep things cycling, and to create that aggregated soil that we need to grow crops and be resilient to all the erratic climate that we're seeing. All right, so let's talk briefly about nitrogen gas in the air and how that gets into the agricultural system. And I know most people realize that it's actually a bacteria that can do that. And in agriculture, we have legumes, right? We have clover, we have white clover, alfalfa, bird's foot trefoil. Those are, some of the most common legumes here in Vermont, but soybeans, dry beans, peas, lentils, all the leguminous crops that we grow or people grow can have an association with a bacteria, and there's different ones. But for most of the legumes or most of the forage legumes, I guess, the bacteria is a rhizobium. For soybeans, it's a different bacteria, but mostly it's a rhizobium species. And those bacteria form a symbiotic relationship with the legume plant roots. Okay, so symbiotic means that each partner gets a benefit, right? It's not a parasite, so it's not just taking from the legume. It's symbiotic, so the legume gets something from having the bacteria there, and the bacteria gets something from the legume. Okay, so the bacteria itself has the ability to take nitrogen gas out of the air and convert it into a form that it can use, but also the plant can use. Okay, now what does the rhizobium get in exchange for that nitrogen? Now, in exchange, it gets energy, sugar, carbon from the legume. Okay, so the legume has to give up some energy, some carbohydrates to the bacteria in order to get the nitrogen. Okay, so it's a symbiotic relationship. So one of the things that you've probably heard in the past is that a crop like alfalfa can get lazy. right? So what does that mean? Well, it can get lazy, which maybe isn't the right term, but basically, if you give a legume nitrogen, and so let's say you fertilize alfalfa with nitrogen, well, you would do that. But one of the things we do is we use manure, right, which has nitrogen in it. So we fertilize the legume with nitrogen. Well, if it has nitrogen available, it's not going to give up any energy to this bacteria freeloader, right? And it will stop its association. So if you provide a legume too much nitrogen, it will not want to associate with the bacteria. So we say it gets lazy. Now, if you want to obviously maximize that relationship, you're going to want to manage how much nitrogen you're putting on those fields. So when we have mixed stands of legumes and grasses, we have to be really careful about how we manage fertility in those stands, especially if we want to have those legumes there making nitrogen, right? There are some other associations that occur in the soil that transfer nutrients between plants. Mycorrhizae are one of those. Um, but mycorrhizae aren't always as common in agricultural systems. And the reason for that, again, is because we're generally fertilizing plants so that they get the nutrients that they need. We're not relying maybe as much as we could on these types of associations um, to get our crops the nutrients they need, but we could. All right, so let's dive in. We have about sorry, I'm just looking at the time because we have a webinar at noon, so I have to I have to make sure I'm done. And Lindsay is Lindsay's on, so just want to make sure she's ready at that time to do the Go Crop. There she is. Okay.
I'm trying to say thumbs up, but
Okay.
There
Nope,
we go.
that's fine.
Good to go.
All right. So on-farm nitrogen sources. We have manure, we have legumes, and then we have sod and cover crops, or your hay fields. We have crop residues and cover crops. And these are all really different. They bring different amounts and different types of nitrogen into the system. Okay. So let's talk about manure. So manure is obviously a waste that comes from our livestock. And it's, what they didn't utilize, right, when you were feeding them. And it's very nutrient rich and it's nitrogen rich as well. Now, this is just an example, but again, just trying to talk a bit about the nitrogen in manure and what that looks like and how our management impacts how much we get available to the crops. Okay, so kind of switching gears here. I just talked to you all about the nitrogen cycle. And now we're going to get into the forms of nitrogen you have on your farm. Okay. All right. So here you can see solid manure, pounds of nitrogen per ton. So dairy manure, beef manure, swine manure. And again, these are examples, may not reflect what you have. So in dairy manure, roughly 3 pounds of nitrogen per ton of manure. And if you surface apply that manure, 3 pounds, okay? If you incorporate the manure, you get 4 pounds. So why, if you surface apply the manure, do you get 3 out of the manure available to your crop? And when you incorporate it, you get 4 pounds. And you can see that's something that we see with beef manure, swine manure. If you apply the manure on the surface, okay, the amount of nitrogen you get to the crop, available nitrogen, so that's ammonium and nitrates, is less if you surface apply it than if you incorporate it. Okay. So, nobody's going to answer. So I'll give you the answer. If you surface apply the manure, you get less nitrogen. So think about all the things we talked about. If you haven't fallen asleep yet, right? Nitrogen can be lost on the soil surface to volatilization. If you incorporate that nitrogen or that manure into the ground, you're not going to lose nitrogen from the manure to volatilization, to the air, okay? So you will have more nitrogen available if you incorporate the manure than if you lay it on the surface. Okay, so let's dig into this a bit because it's not that simple, of course. All right, so with manure, and you'll see this on your manure test, you will see two types of nitrogen. You're going to see the amount of organic nitrogen in the manure, and then you're going to see the amount of ammonium nitrogen in the manure. It's going to measure both. Ammonium nitrogen in the manure comes from the urine. Okay. It's urea N, just like the fertilizer. It's ammonium N. So if you remember, this is the plant available form. It is readily available for your crop to utilize immediately, right? Or for it to get converted to nitrates, etc. This also is easily lost as ammonium gas, right? Volatilization. So this fraction of nitrogen in your manure, depending on how much is there, if you surface apply it, some amount of this will likely be lost to volatilization. So we're going to estimate that in your NMP, okay? If you incorporate it, you actually retain more of this. The other nitrogen in your manure is in the organic form. Okay, so nitrogen stuck onto carbon. We know, you just learned, that this, to become available, has to be broken down by microbes. And how quickly it gets broken down depends on lots of factors, right? It's going to depend on the microbial activity of the soil. It's going to depend on the material you put on, like how much carbon is in there. It's going to depend on how warm it is, lots of factors here, okay? So it's more slowly available and less predictable. When we are calculating how much nitrogen will be available to your crop from the manure that you're adding, we will estimate how much we think we're going to get from the ammonium N, okay, based on if it's incorporated, if it's on the surface, is it applied in the spring, is it applied in the fall, okay? And then we're going to add that to how much we think we're going to get from organic nitrogen. So your total manure nitrogen credit that you're going to get for your crops will be dependent on these two sources and how much we think we're going to get. Okay, it's a complete estimate. So, we're not measuring it in the soil. We're taking what you're adding. We got to know the quality of it, which is why we need a manure test. And then we look at your management and the soil type, some other factors. And then we try to estimate how much you'll actually get for that crop. Okay. All right, so let's go through an example of that so you can see a little more clearly the process. And again, Go Crop does all of this for you, but it's important to understand how timing, etc., influences how much you get, right? Okay, so here's liquid manure. This is a book value for nutrient analysis. So you can see that the total amount of nitrogen available, or total amount of nitrogen, sorry, in the manure is 25 pounds per 1,000 gallons. So every 1,000 gallons of manure you have in that manure pit has 25 pounds of nitrogen in it. That's a lot, right? Okay, now 12 pounds of that is in the urea form. Okay, this can be immediately used by your plants. 13 pounds is in the organic form. That's going to break down slower, okay, depending on a lot of factors. But the potential is 25 pounds. So you go out and you put down 7,000 gallons per acre of manure. So in every 7,000 gallons, you have 175 pounds total nitrogen that you're putting on that field. That should be enough nitrogen to fertilize most crops in Vermont. Okay. That's 84 pounds of ammonium N. 84 pounds, that's a lot of nitrogen. That's a lot of urea fertilizer. 91 pounds of organic nitrogen, quick, slow. And then you also are putting on 56 pounds of phosphorus and 140 pounds of potassium. So lots of fertilizer here, okay? Lots of fertilizer. Soil test results. You need 120 pounds of nitrogen. Put that on, okay? You need 40 pounds of phosphorus. You're over a little bit. And you need 120 pounds of potassium. You're under a little bit, okay? Now, if you're just looking at total nitrogen, you're thinking, wow, I got it made. I got plenty. I don't need to do anything else, okay? But I've already told you, this could be lost, could be unavailable. How much are we actually thinking we're gonna get out of this 175 pounds? Okay, all right. The availability of the urea N, the ammonium N, is dependent on incorporation. It really is, okay? And so here's days after spreading and ammonium loss versus ammonium availability, okay? So the longer you wait to incorporate, if you can, right? If you're on a hayfield, doesn't matter, okay? But if you're on a cornfield, the longer you wait to incorporate, the greater risk of loss of that urea. So if you're growing a crop where you're using tillage and you can incorporate that manure or inject it, you're going to want to do that as soon as possible to minimize the loss of the urea nitrogen. Okay. So over here, you can look if, let's say, you're injecting it or you're incorporating it immediately through tillage, you don't lose hardly any of it. If you wait even 2 days, right, you're losing 30%. 30% of that 84 pounds is gone, right? So it pays, if you can, to get that manure in the ground as soon as possible, right? By 7 days, you've lost anywhere between 60 and 80 to 90% of that urea nitrogen. So again, this is fertilizer. You had 84 pounds sitting there. Do you want 84 pounds? Okay. Or do you want 30 pounds, 40 pounds, 20 pounds? So that's money, right? Okay, so here's the table that we will use. It's in GoCrop, so GoCrop will estimate all of this for you. You have the availability of ammonium nitrogen from spring or summer applied manure. So this is important. This is not in the fall when there's nothing growing. This is you're going to apply the manure heading into the growing season. Okay, so again, this shows you the same thing that was on that chart. If you incorporate the manure immediately or you're injecting it, you'll get most of that urea N that's in the manure. Okay, now of course, this could be lost in the soil too, but we're only estimating at this point volatilization. Now, once you start like the time to incorporation starts to grow, you can see the losses become very significant. Okay, and if you're on a hay field and you're not incorporating, you can't clearly, you can lose a significant amount of that urea nitrogen, or you will lose. Okay, now this is in the fall. And so in the fall, of course, there's nothing growing. Right? At some point, you know, especially if you're putting manure on right before the winter spreading ban, that nitrogen there will predominantly, you know, be lost in the system. Now, if you get the manure on earlier and you have an actively growing crop out there, maybe different. Okay. But you can see when you're putting this manure on in the fall, just immediately, even if you're incorporating it immediately, you're going to lose 60%. All right. So it doesn't, you know, I understand why obviously people put manure on fields in the fall, but really, if you are fall applying manure, the best place to put it are on hay fields. Not that people do that, because, you know, on a cornfield, generally there's nothing growing unless you have a cover crop, and so the losses are going to be higher. On hayfield, there is a chance if the crop's still growing, it will utilize some of that nitrogen better. Okay, so down here at the bottom, let's just go through the example. We had 84 pounds of ammonium nitrogen available. We put it on in the fall, and we didn't incorporate it, so there's 15% roughly that will be available to the crop the next year, and that ends up being 12 pounds, right? 13 pounds of 84. Now, even with our best effort, and we get it incorporated, then we're still losing a lot of nitrogen opportunity, and we'll only get 30 pounds for that crop the subsequent year. Okay, so you can really see that managing timing and time to incorporation is critical. Okay, let's go over the organic nitrogen. So this is slow. Okay, you're not going to get all of it. You got carbon in there. Some of it's easy for the microbes to break down. Some of it's not. The quick stuff will be broken down first, and then some of the slowly degradable stuff will be available later, right? So you can kind of think about this the same way we look at forages when we're feeding cattle. You know, as a plant becomes more mature, the amount of protein in it goes down, but the amount of lignin goes up in that plant. And when you feed it to a cow, it can't even break it down, right? Can't even utilize it. In the soil, it's kind of the same way, where that really lush, easy to break down material will be utilized, and the nutrients in that utilized quickly by the microbes, and then obviously made available to your plants. But that lignin material, heavy cellulose, will break down slower. Okay, and this is important because When you applied that manure, you put on 91 pounds of organic nitrogen, but you're not going to get all that, not in the first year. Okay. In the first year, you'll get anywhere from, as much as 36%, okay, but as little as 14%, okay? So it's a range, high of, 36, low of 14%. So of that 91 pounds, you're only going to get, 20, maybe 30 pounds of it in year one. Now, the good thing about the organic matter is that it will break down over time. Okay. You don't lose it per se to volatilization or leaching. You just got to wait for the microbes to break it down. Okay. So in year one, you can see here, if you put the manure on and you till it in, right, you'll get more of that organic nitrogen released because you've put that nutrient source directly in contact with the microbes. Okay. Now, we do assume that if you have a better drained soil, it'll break down quicker. And some of that has to do with what we talked about, the environment for the microbes. And if you have a poorly drained soil, we're saying that it's going to take longer for it to break down. Okay. And then if you surface apply it, you get less. Okay. The microbes don't have direct access. It takes more time. So again, if you are tilling, or in this case, maybe injecting, you will get more of that organic nitrogen faster. Okay. Now, I think it's important to note here, this is sort of like a bank account. When you're adding that organic nitrogen, you'll get some in year one, but then you also see that in year two. So you put it on this year, you get some this year, and then the following year, you'll get a little more, 12%, 10, 12%. And then again, in year 3 years after applying that manure, you're still getting some of that organic nitrogen broken down. Okay. But you can't plan for all 91 pounds in the first year. So Go Crop, again, will walk you through that. And based on, when you're applying the manure, your soil type, and the manure analysis, it'll tell you what your credit is for nitrogen to grow the crop. So I know there's a lot here. And, you'll start to see these principles kind of go into play as you're building your NMP. Okay. So if we just wrap up this example here, you can see when we applied the manure, this is the nutrients that went on that field on every acre. Okay, a lot. This is what was actually available. Okay, or we predicted was available. So overall, we ended up with 62 pounds of that 175 pounds. Remember, I said our crop needed 120. So we are short for this year. So again, that's why we have to know, right, what exactly you're putting on the fields, how much, what's in it, how are you doing it, so that we can predict how much you're going to get potentially, how much the crop needs, and if there's a remaining need or not. Okay, so this is important. This is another, 120 pounds of urea or synthetic fertilizer that should go on the field, or some kind of fertility, to meet the needs of the crop. So that's what we're going to be figuring out here in the coming weeks. Just to touch quickly on nitrogen credits from alfalfa or clover or white clover, it can produce a lot of nitrogen. Okay. We don't generally have a lot of 100% stands of alfalfa, but if we did, you can see the amount of nitrogen credit that one can get from a good stand of alfalfa that's plowed under, decomposes, and becomes available to the subsequent crop. Okay, so how much of that legume nitrogen can be available to the next crop will be dependent on, how good the crop is, what kind of soil, and how much growth is plowed under. Again, we don't have a lot of pure stands. Red clover and soybean nitrogen credits tend to be quite a bit less. Soybean is actually pretty negligible. If you're growing soybeans, you get about 25 or 30 pounds of nitrogen credit from the soybean, not a lot. Red clover, you're usually around 70 pounds, maybe 80 or 90. So again, a lot less than alfalfa. Okay, sod and cover crops. This will be the last thing I touch on. So if you're plowing down a mixed stand of hay, grass, right? Mostly grass, a little bit of legume. You do get nitrogen credit for that, okay? But it's not new nitrogen. It's the nitrogen that's embodied in the grass, right? Itself. So you're cutting grass and you're measuring the crude protein content of it for your cows. That protein that's in that forage is the same protein nitrogen that if you plow it under will become available to the microbes and then to the crop you're growing. Okay, so it's less than a legume because there's no rhizobium there, right? There's no microbe making nitrogen. It's just what that crop has taken up in its own biomass, right? So if you're plowing down a hayfield, you will get nitrogen credit for that. Okay. Now, same with cover crops. Most cover crops, winter rye, any cereal, okay, they're not making nitrogen. They are just taking up residual nitrogen, excess nitrogen from your cornfield, let's say, and holding it there for the next year. Okay, so if you have a lot of residual nitrogen, essentially that cover crop, if it grows well, right, and you have 6 to 8 inches of growth, and then you till that under, you will get some nitrogen credit from that. But again, it's relatively small. It's generally around 25 to 30 pounds. All right, so I think with that, I'm going to wrap up and let Lindsay maybe take a few minutes. Sorry, take a little break. And then we'll let Lindsay get into Go Crop. And again, I know this is a lot of information. It's a lot of, I know this stuff, and it's a lot when I'm even saying it. So it's like a fire hose of knowledge. And I will say that all of that is in your manual again. So you do have the opportunity, if you feel like it, to go back in and reread all of this. Okay. Lindsay, what we talked about going over in Go Crop is putting in the manure storages, production, nutrient analysis, and then also got to put in the crops, rotation, and the crops.
I think last week we went over manure entries.
Oh, okay. All right.
But we'll have to enter in at least fields before we get to crops.
Okay.
So we can.
You didn't get to crops fields last week.
No, we didn't. So I'm happy to do like field and crop rotations, and that would also leave us like soil test import and risk management. Do we want to cover that today or wait till next week?
I think whatever you get through in an hour. Just keep plugging through it.
Okay, I'll go through the rest in order up to rotations.
Yeah.
And hopefully we can do that in an hour.
No, I know
Um,
it's a lot, so.
and for other folks in there, I'm taking breaks. Let's reconvene at noon, so in 5 minutes,
Okay.
please. Thank you. Hey, folks, so we're just getting started here again with our next pieces in GoCrop, and I'm Lindsay and with Extension, and I'm going to share my screen. All right, so just in case you're not there yet and you're looking to get into GoCrop, we're going to start in Chrome, and up in the web address bar, you'll type in the URL, www.gocrop.com. Maybe by now it's already popping up because your computer is used to it. So click enter. You'll probably end up on this screen. You'll notice that for my account, because I've already logged in a bunch, it says your farms, but the button you'll probably click will be log in. And when you click log in, then you'll have the opportunity to enter your login name and your password. But for me, since it's saved, it's just gonna go right into my GoCrop main account, right? So just to catch us up to speed, I know it's been a week and GoCrop is a little bit new. Our navigation is that we've got this green menu on the left where we'll have a button with all farms. We have our list of farms here. You'll probably only have one. And our account information, and then this little reminder letting us know when GoCrop updates. So for us, we're going to go into the 2026 class. You'll go into whatever farm name you have listed here. Once you get there, you'll see that you have a plan, probably just one, and I have just one, and it's the 2026 annual plan because we are planning for 2026. Now we've entered into a plan, we have these three categories on the left: planning, records, and farm assets. We know we're in planning because it's in dark green, and we're going to stick in planning today. Once we click on our annual plan and we know it's ready to click on because it turns from gray to light blue, then we see our landing page for our plan. And on here, right, we've got our dashboard, which shows us our checklist, our plan status, and our plan settings. And from here, we can also go to reports. But today, we are going to start in field details and see where we left off there, right? So in our first week, we did narratives and farm info. And then last week, we entered our nutrient sources and nutrient analyses and equipment. I think Heather went over these pieces today and what to look for in your manure report. But if you have any questions about what needs to be entered for those to continue on, please connect with me after today or anybody else you might know, doesn't have to be me, about getting those entered in. So we're going to click on field details. Oh, and look at us. We did go over how to enter fields. So just as a quick refresher, what we have entered in for field details are our field name, our track of field numbers, the field size, if it's the ownership type, if it's owned or leased, and then we have an opportunity to outline our fields, provide boundaries. This is not required, but it's very helpful. Now we're going to go over into land info land. And to do that, I'm first just going to go back to my list view because I want to go back to land info in my list view as well. And to get to land info, I can either click move on to next step in the lower right, or I can click on the step in the steps wizard. That's what some people call it. The GoCrop step list. I'm going to click land info. And now I can see my same fields. And I can see which ones we completed. So last week we completed the diamond field, large pasture, rectangle field, but didn't quite get to square field. But this is what we would see there. If we open up our land info, we have our dominant soil type information. You may need to input some information that doesn't get pulled from the Surgo database. So in this example, it's depth to bedrock. Then you would have also manually entered nitrogen leaching index, tolerable soil loss, and your elevation and distance to stream. Again, if you have any questions on fields and land info, feel free to reach out and we can help get those done. Apparently, I forgot that we did these last week, so we are like way ahead of where I thought we were. So for today, we'll just go over soil tests, risk management, crop rotation, and crops, which will set us up really nicely to keep working on nutrient balancing in subsequent weeks. So for soil tests, if I click here, right, we're going to see the same thing we've seen in our previous two steps. We've got our field name, track and field number, and then instead of complete or incomplete, it says due for test or test up to date or something like that on the right-hand side. We haven't entered in any of our soil tests, so that's on the right. There are a couple of different ways to enter soil tests. I'm going to show you how to do them each one by one manually, and then I'm also going to show you how to import your soil test for all your fields if you have an Excel or a CSV spreadsheet. If you have one from UVM, it's really easy just to import in. If you have a soil test in a CSV or Excel from a different laboratory, we just need to do a couple of column heading changes in order for the import to be successful. And we'll go over that in a moment, but that's kind of the layout for going over the soil test step. So there are two different ways to enter in your record one by one for a soil test, because a soil test is a record. It's a piece of data collected on a particular date. And we can do that by first choosing our field, and then, when we choose our field, we get some information. It says no matching items right here because we don't have a single soil test. After we enter one, those soil tests will appear below, and it will GoCrop will keep the records for you stored in this field. So 3 years from now, when you come to update your test, you'll still see the soil test that you took maybe last fall, and then you'll start to see the new ones that you entered for, maybe that would be 2027 if you had taken your last ones in 2024. But here, right, field name, we would have our list of soil tests taken, and then we have a due for test. And just some orientation, right, I can flip through my fields here using these little carrots, so I can return to my list here. But we're going to add our soil test by clicking add soil test in the upper right-hand corner. And then I get this form. It's defaulting to the location I'm in. I would change the sample date. So this might not be the date you see on your soil test report. You might see date received by or date analyzed by, but the date that we want to have here in our soil test is the date the sample was taken. And then we'll enter the values as you see them in your soil test report. So I'm going to make up some values here. And just like when we talked about with entering manure test results, please just leave this form as it is. Don't change the results or the nutrient type. Don't change the units associated with them. If you really wanted to, you could add another result or nutrient that you wanted to track over time, but please resist the urge to add everything that's on your soil test results. Again, GoCrop is just asking you for what it needs to make sure that your plant meets the 590 standards and the Vermont Agency of Ag required agricultural practices. So save yourself some trouble, save yourself some hassle, and just stick with what GoCrop is asking you for here. I guess I forgot to mention up here too, you can add in the lab of where you received it. This is an optional thing to enter. It's kind of nice to keep track of what labs you're sending soil samples to, but it's also not necessary. So once you enter your soil test, you can click save, and then it will save. It'll show you the soil test displayed here. It says the soil test is complete because we entered in every single part of the form, and now our tag has changed from due for test and up to date. So I'm going to do just one more just to show you how quickly it can be, but I'm going to do that from the record section instead. So we're dipping our toes into a different tab in our menu, but I want to show you how those forms are the same, whether you're entering them from your soil test tab in your plan or you're entering them from your records tab in your big sidebar menu. So I'm going to click on my records tab. And what we see here is, a list of all the records we've already entered, right? We've got 3 fertilizer analyses and a manure test. We got the soil test I just entered. And GoCrop is showing me my soil test, my records for my last 2 years. And it will continually default to just those two. One of the nice things about this new layout in GoCrop, which if you're new to GoCrop, you don't know it's the new layout, but one of the things that I really like about it is this is a really great place where these filtering systems really shine. So if I click filter controls here, I can filter to see which records are complete, the record type, the fertilizer analysis, manure test, and soil test. And these are, you saw potentially there are more records you can enter. So this type will grow as you enter different types of records. And then your years will continue to build off each other as you use GoCrop. And we have locations. We only have a record entered for one field, so that's the only location we can choose from. But as you add records to other fields, they will populate here. And then our nutrient sources are listed as well. So I just wanted to show you that this is here. And then just like in a bunch of other places in GoCrop, to add a new anything, in this case a new record, we go in the upper right hand corner and click add new record. Now what we see, right, we still have the same green sidebar menu, and now we see a list of all of our records on the left. And what's a little bit different about this screen than when we saw it when we were in the field is that now I get to choose which new record I'm going to add, right? When I was back in planning, I was on the soil test step, so I wanted to add new records. GoCrop was like, well, you're in soil test, clearly you want to enter a soil test, but now that we're in record, it doesn't really know, and so you need to tell it. I'm going to click this drop down menu, and we're going to scroll down a little bit, and you see that we have two options, soil test and soil test import. I want to show you how to enter just one soil test. So I'm going to choose soil test, and then in a few moments, I'll show you how to do the soil test import. So now that I've chosen soil test, I basically have the same form that we just saw when we were in the soil test step of planning. But one of the little differences here is that because we were in planning, we had chosen a field and then added the soil test. And here we said, oh, we're going to add a soil test. And so GoCrop doesn't know which field to add it to. So we'll choose our location. We'll again enter our sample date, and then we'll enter our three results: our organic matter, our pH, our effective cation exchange capacity, our phosphorus, our potassium amount, and our aluminum. And what's a little bit different here too is that if you are going to enter them manually, you can also click, oh, you know what? I've done one soil test and I'm going to add another. So I'm going to click this button right here below it, and I can keep adding new soil tests. This gets a little bit wonky because even though I'm adding another one, what is nice about it is that it keeps our sample date, but it copies everything else over too. So we need to change our location, and we would need to update all of our results and our nutrients. It's a little bit fun. Oh, you know what? I made a boo-boo right here. I got my wires crossed. So I'm going to back up because I was thinking about previous GoCrop and some of the functionality here. When I clicked add another, what that add another was doing was actually adding a fourth nutrient. And you know what? I don't want to do that, right? I just gave you that advice of not adding another nutrient. So really, this add other is not adding another test. It is adding another nutrient. So I'm going to X this out, and I'm going to put all my values back to what they were, or something similar to what they might have been. So sorry, that was a little bit confusing. I made a goof on that. So you can only enter soil, so encapsulating, or summarizing, you can enter one soil test at a time from your planning, and you can enter one soil test at a time from your record. Once you do it from your record, you click save. It brings you back to this screen, which shows you all the records that you have entered. So I'm going to show you how to import soil tests. And before I do that, I want to just kind of briefly go over what a soil test might look like when you get it from the UVM's AETL. I'm going to stop my share and reshare in a moment. So one of the really nice things about new Go crop is that before, if you got a soil test as an Excel, you need to go to like File, Save As, change it to a CSV. You don't need to do that anymore. GoCrop will import soil tests if they come as CSVs or if they come as Excels. If you got soil tests from a lab and all they gave you were PDFs, you can always enter those individually manually, but you can also probably request that from them to get either a CSV or Excel version of your soil test to be able to import it. If you've only got like 5 or 6 fields, manual is just as easy, but if you have something like 15 or 20, import is just a huge time-saving device. So this is what an example of a spreadsheet from UVM's AETL, and we have a bunch of these column headings here. This is actually a date, but we have lab ID, iron, custom sample name, which is the name that was given on the submission form, aluminum, the order number, sodium, the date, so on and so forth. Now we just saw the soil test form, so we know what the things that we really need to enter are just 6 different types of nutrients and results. We don't need to do anything with this spreadsheet. GoCrop will ignore them for us, but I did want to show you what these headings look like. So in the event that you've got soil test results from another lab, what you're going to want to do is, wherever the field name was, use this exact heading in the column. Whatever the date is, make sure that you use date, make sure that it's pH in exactly like lowercase p, uppercase h, that you have organic matter percent just as written here, cation exchange capacity, available P, available phosphorus written just like this, so on and so forth, so the other nutrients that GoCrop will import. So that's what this looks like here. I'm going to close this out, and now we're going to go take a look at GoCrop if my computer will cooperate. One of the other things that is important is to make sure that whatever CSV or Excel that you are importing is closed. GoCrop will tell you a warning if you're trying to import it and it's still open. It's like, you can't make the connection. You can only do one thing at a time. Okay, here. So we saw that. I'm going to go to add new record, choose something to add, and instead of going to soil test, I'm going to go to my soil test import. And basically there's 4 simple steps. And the first one is we have to choose the file. What are we importing? So we'll click that. I don't know what this is called, but this pops up and we can choose whatever file we want to use. And so this is, if you do have a CSV or an Excel file, and maybe it's in a email chain, you're going to want to download that and then download it somewhere where you know how to find it in terms of which file folder it is in. If you might just want to download it right to downloads, then you can go right to your downloads folder to download it. But for me in this demonstration, I threw it up on my desktop just so that I knew where to find it. And I just said I threw up on my desktop, which is not a pleasant idea. But here we are. So we're going to click the test file that I just showed you, click open. And now GoCrop's like, great. We see this. We see that it's got 6 soil tests. Fantastic. We're going to click on next step. And now there's like this big old screen where you can see a lot of different things. And I want you to ignore everything that's on here, except for the fact that we need to match up our values that were on the spreadsheet with the field names that we have in our in GoCrop. And so what's really nice is we can click this drop down and say, oh, my backfield, I know that when I submitted it was backfield, but really that's a large pasture. My front field is really the diamond field. Chances are that you will, these will be much more closely aligned when you're importing. It might also be possible that you have the field names on the right, but just the track and field numbers on the left. And so you'll have to do a little bit of comparing to make sure that those line up. One thing that you'll see here on the left is that in this example, I have three entries, new 1, new 2, and new average. And in this example, my field name is called new. And because my field was greater than 20 acres, I had to have 2 different soil tests to accommodate that. But what I want to do when I'm thinking about my recommendations is not necessarily choose one soil test over the other soil test, but I want to have an average of those. So when I was in my spreadsheet, one of the things that I had done over here is I averaged these for new field average. And that was just a simple equation equals average of these two. And then you can use that equation throughout the rest of the row. And if you have any questions about how to handle this, whether that's in GoCrop when you're importing or when you're entering soil tests, I'm happy to help troubleshoot that too, or help walk you through that process. One of the things that we'll see when we do this is what that looks like to have multiple soil tests within GoCrop at any one time. So I'm going to close this out. We're coming back to GoCrop here. And in this example, I'm going to say that my square field is the one that has that average value. And then for field 6, we'll say it's rectangle field. Like I said, we have like this show all, and I will show you this, but again, just ignore it. You don't need to click it. But that's showing the fields above with the show all below. It will show us every single heading for all the rest of the columns that were in that spreadsheet and what those values are. In general, GoCrop's just trying to import them what it needs the easiest way possible. So this is just like the back end of like what that looks like. You don't really need to think about it too much or even click on that button, but just in case you were very curious, that's what that does. But I'm going to move on. I'm going to choose preview with these settings, which then basically says, okay, we have all these soil test results and they're all matched up. Great, perfect, we can move on. In the event that you have a soil test on your CSV or Excel file that you didn't match up with a field, that'll look a little bit different. I'll show you what that looks like. I'll just go through this a little quickly here. And so if I have a soil test that's not matched with a field, then it says, oh, you know what? We have this information. We have nowhere to go with it. Are you sure that you wanted to not include this? And if you took a soil sample for a field you're not including in the NMP plan, you would click skip, and then this button would say submit for import and move on. In this case, I was like, oops, I forgot to match it up. I'm going to click fix. And when I do that, I see this, and now I can choose my location, which is the missing part of this. And then I click save, and now it says, okay, we're all ready to go. We have what we need. Now I'm going to submit my import. And now it says import complete. All my records have imported successfully. I'll click close. And now it's not showing me my soil tests. Where did they go? What happened? It's okay. We're going to click this filtering devices. And now we see, right, that we had 25 and 26 highlighted to see. Well, the soil test results that I entered were for 2024. And if I want to see those, I'll click on 2024. And now you can see as soon as I click that, I got a bunch more listed here. And maybe I want to further filter this by just seeing what my soil test records are. And to do that, I'll click soil test. I can even now filter by field, right? I got my diamond field, large pasture, rectangle, and square fields because they all have soil tests associated with them. But just to give us a little bit of a flavor of what that looks like, here we have all our soil tests from 2024 onward. Now, remember I had that field that had 3 soil tests, my rectangle field. I'm just going to throw this filter on just to kind of like help my brain not be so distracted by my other fields. Because right now, they all have the same test date. And what gets a little bit wonky with this is that GoCrop, when it wants to generate recommendations based off of your soil test, it might not know which one to choose because they all 3 have the same date, and GoCrop wants the most recent one for that recommendation. So in the event that you have two soil tests, like I said, you have three soil tests for one field. You've got your there are two raw scores and then the average score, and you want to use the average. You can look at each one of these soil tests. And you're like, okay, my value here is my pH is 6.22, my first one. My second one is 6.18, and my third one is 6.2. Well, that would most likely mean then that my third one is my average, because I'm looking at my pH to figure out which is my average. The average of 6.22 and 6.18 is 6.2. And so to kind of key in GoCrop to get it to use this soil test, the only thing I'm going to do is change the sample date by 1 day. That really has no impact on how the standards are met. So to do that, I'm going to click Edit Record, clean up all that information. I'm going to click on my little calendar and say, you know what? It was the following day. And then that'll let GoCrop know to use that soil test report when generating your recommendations. I think I should also say too that it's worth looking at your soil tests if you have multiple for the same field to see how closely aligned that they are, right? And if for some reason they're wildly different, that might be a call to have some conversation of, well, does it make sense to manage them the same if their soil fertility is so different? And if that is your situation, we can kind of talk about best practices and how to create two fields within GoCrop, which is just like entering a new field and omitting the large one that you might have entered already. All right, so we went over soil tests, how to enter them individually, how to import them. So now we're going to go back to planning. We're going to do our 2026 plan. And our soil test got a nice check mark because all our fields have their soil test. And isn't that satisfying that they all say up to date? So now we'll move on to risk management. Risk management, right, we see the exact same things that we have been seeing on all the steps, field name, track and field number, and then they all say blank, right, because we haven't entered anything. We haven't even started. And we've got our help text here telling us how to navigate around GoCrop. I'm just going to close that out to declutter my screen a little bit by pressing this little X in the upper right-hand corner. And I'm going to start looking at my risk management information on my diamond field. Like what do we enter here? So in this case, right, it's asking for vegetative buffer width, a whole bunch of other things. And if you're wondering, what does it mean by vegetative buffer width or manure settings spread setback, you can click this little help text, which is the circle with the little question mark in it, to get us some more descriptions. I'm going to kind of close that out just to declutter my screen a little bit. And I'll show you how to enter this individually, but there's also this really nice bulk edit feature in GoCrop in the event that you have a lot of fields that basically have the same information. So your vegetated buffer width is going to be the amount of perennial vegetation that you have from the edge of your field to the water source or waterway. At a minimum, this should always be 25 feet. It can be much larger. It can be the entire width of a forest if that is where the nearest stream is. But at a minimum, it should be 25 feet. If you have questions about this, we're happy to look at a map and help you think about how to figure that out. But in general, this is also like to a blue line, but sometimes blue lines and maps don't pick up on all the blue lines, or sometimes there's an errant blue line. So, and this is the shortest distance from the edge of your field to the bank of an adjoining surface water, at least a minimum of 25 feet. Now your manure spread setback is anything in addition to that. So usually this number is 0. There's a few people I've worked with where they're like, yep, we have that perennial vegetated buffer width, but also that's kind of a low wet spot that's really close to the stream. And so we don't spread on that either. So we do have a manure setting spread back. But in general, this is 0. And this question of has living vegetation in April, if you have any perennial hay fields or perennial pastures, this answer is going to be yes. You will also choose yes if you have a really robust winter surviving cover crop like winter rye or when wheat even has been being used recently. But we're talking about something that's, covering the field and is living and doing well. We're not talking about like a broadcasted cover crop towards the end of October that's like a few sparse hairs. This is, some decent ground cover that's going to help with nutrient retention and reduce erosion. So for that, you click yes. And then has pattern tile drainage, either yes or no. And this really is pattern tile drainage. It's like if you've got tile drainage in your field that's every 10, 20, or 30 field, like it's systemic, versus if you have a low spot and you're draining it, or like a few orphan tile lines. If you have a few orphan tile lines, you will click no. If you've got that systemic pattern tile drainage, you will click yes. And part of that is because the pattern tile drainage across the entire field changes the hydrological conductivity, like how quickly that water can move through the soil profile. And that's partially why that's there, which contributes to the P index and potential subsurface P phosphorus runoff. So choose whatever makes the most sense for you here. And then you'll click frequently flooded. This is based off of maps. If you feel like your map has identified a field of yours that is not frequently flooded, you can go to the Agency of Ag website and request an exemption. But in general, follow the maps that you are provided with and choose frequently flooded, yes or no. Sediment trap structure. That has been here since I've been here, and we've never used it. So you can just ignore that unless you really do have one of these. But we, in general, just no. And then enter any water quality consideration. So if you've got a well, any other thing that you think may impact water quality, you can make a note of this here. And this is one of the places where it really is text that you enter and it shows up on reports. So you can, and if you don't have any water quality considerations, you can leave it blank or you can write an NA. It's up to you. Once you're done with this, you'll click save, and I can continue cycling through my fields, entering all the information one by one. Or in this example, what I want to do is go back to my list, and I have this complete. And there are two different ways where data entry in GoCrop has been really streamlined. And one of those ways is you can copy the field information to a field. So if I wanted to copy my diamond field information, all of it writ large, to large pasture, I would click on my large pasture, click copy, and say where to my large pasture. I'm going to choose my plan, which is this plan, the current plan. If I had multiple years of plans, that would show up in my dropdown, but I only have this one option. And then I'll choose the field from which I want to copy from, and it's going to be my diamond field. That's the only information I have. Click diamond field. And it tells me now, it says, okay, anything that you have in your large pasture, if I had put anything in there, and I know I haven't because I can see large pasture, it's blank over here, it would overwrite it. So I'm not concerned about it, but that's what this text is telling me. I'm going to click copy now, and now it's complete. You may have fields that have a lot of the same information and you want to enter it all at once. And if that's the case, you can click those fields. So in this case, right, maybe my rectangle field and square field are very similar to each other or have the same characteristics. I can click both of those and I can choose edit. And this is a bulk edit function. And now it says, and now I have that exact same form. But notice how it doesn't have location at the top. It's because it's applying it to the fields I selected. If I want to see what those fields are that I selected to bulk edit, I can click show selected and it'll show it right here. And then I'm going to enter my information. Click save. I'm going to click done. Now it's taking me back to my list screen and everything's complete. There may be an instance where like, you know, I want everything on some of my fields to be the same because all that information is the same on all of my fields. You can click all of them. Whoops. Click all of them. And you can also do that really quickly by using this upper left-hand like top square to select all or deselect all. So if I go to edit, notice now that because a bunch of my answers were the same across all my fields, that information remains true, right? For all my fields, I manually entered or copied 25 feet for vegetated buffer width, 0 for manure spreading setback, and no for has pattern tile drainage, and I left my sediment trap structure has none. But because the values that I entered were different across my fields for living vegetation and frequently flooded, it doesn't show up in that way. And so when I'm looking at this, I might say, well, you know, I do feel good that each one of my fields, like they don't all have the same, like the answer for living vegetation isn't the same. But I do know that all my fields are not frequently flooded. I must have made a boo-boo somewhere. I'm going to click this. I'm going to say no, and then I'm going to click save. It's done here. Click done. It brings me back to the list menu. Everything's still complete. But now when I cycle through, actually, I'm going to come back here because I don't like keeping everything checked. I think that's like really bad practice. So I'm just going to deselect things because I'm done working like that. But I am going to look at each one of my fields and their answers just to show you that like what I entered went through all of them, right? So, you know, I had my multiple values for living vegetation, but now for my frequently flooded, it says no here. It says no here for frequently flooded. It says no here for rectangle field, and it says no here for my square field. So I went through those kind of quickly. They're new functions in GoCrop, but I think they can really streamline the data entry process, right? Like in this example, I chose all my fields to do a bulk edit on, but you can kind of group your fields too, and you might have multiple rounds of bulk edits to get all that data entered at once. How we doing? We got 2 more steps, crop rotation and crops. So we're gonna go into our crop rotations by clicking here on the left. Again, same thing that we've always seen, field name, check field number, and our status symbol, and then our, you know, our field instructions or the general instructions that about navigation and copying. And for this, I'll just close here because I don't want to see that help text anymore. And what I'd like to go over in crop rotations is what it looks like to enter continuous crop rotations, like if you have continuous hay or continuous corn or permanent hay, permanent pasture, and then what it looks like to also have a rotation. So in our diamond field, if let's say this one's going to be continuous corn, so if the field that has been corn will continue to be corn in perpetuity, you don't need to have multiple rows of the corn label. You can just have one because it's going to be the same thing over and over again. I'm going to back up a little bit because I didn't even describe what's happening here on this screen. So in crop rotations, we'll enter your crop rotations, right? So we'll have our crop, and then we'll also enter our Russell 2 annual soil loss. This is something that NRCD has probably calculated for you. And what the Russell 2 value is looking at is the potential amount of soil loss based off of the crop that's grown, soil type, management practices, and a host of other things that I think NRCD could let you know a lot better than I can. But if you have, you know, a continuous corn situation, you'll only have one Russell 2 value, and you only really need to enter it once, so crop will know to use just that one year after year. Putting a random number in here, and GoCrop's like, you entered a number before you entered a crop. You know, to save this form, we need to enter a crop. I'm going to click the drop-down value here, our menu, and we'll choose the crop that's most relevant. So you might choose corn silage. You might have corn silage cover crop. You can kind of scroll down and pick the crop that makes the most sense for this field. For me, we're going to have corn silage as cover crop in this example. And even though I'm going to grow it for the next 10 years, as long as I think I'm going to grow it, I'm just going to leave that one value. But I still need to tell GoCrop what year in rotation it is. So I'll click this. And part of this is if you have multiple rotation years, when you update, GoCrop will then automatically rotate to your next rotation. So you'll see that when you come back and update your plan in 2027. And then we have this last question here, which is, what is your rotation average soil loss? Because we only have 1 year, it's going to be the exact same number, 2.1. We can add any notes we want to here, but they won't show up in any reports. We'll click save. This field is done. I changed to complete over here. I'm going to cycle through here. For this, we've got a rotation year of, I wanted to do another continuous crop, and we're in the large pasture. So for this one, for a permanent pasture field, I'm going to scroll down till I find what I am looking for, which is, in this example, grass pasture. And then I will put in my Russell 2 value. You'll notice that when I put in one crop, grow crop, say if you have another one you want to add, just go on below, but ignore that because it's my permanent pasture. And just like we did for continuous corn, we're going to choose our current year and our rotation, which we only have one option. And then we're going to use our Russell 2 rotation average soil loss, which, because we only have 1 year, it's going to be the exact same number. Okay, so we're done there. That changed to complete. We're going to move on to the next thing. For our rectangle field, this is one where I'm going to have, I think, like a 10-year rotation. And I want to do like 4 years corn and 6 years hay. So for me, I find this the most like straightforward, easy way to go is to add all of my crops at once and then enter my Russell 2 values in. And notice here that when we're transitioning from corn silage to hay, we have some interesting other options here. Scroll down here a little bit. We've got a lot of different hay options. What we want to choose is new for our first year because it's the first year of the hay. And part of why this is important is because the recommendations for soil, the recommendations for nutrient management planning are different if it's new or if it's established hay, and also so are the Russell 2 values. And so if someone's looking at this, that really helps things make a little bit more sense. It's indicating that it's new or it's established. But the other piece too here is that we have 2 different hay establishment options, just straight up hay new or hay grass legume hay new. And so if you have a decent amount of legume in your hay field, you're going to want to choose that as legume. And then we can kind of continue that through. Now that we've had our new one, we're going to go to grass legume hay established. And I'm going to keep doing that. Got to keep scrolling through that. And then maybe you're thinking, okay, I know that my legume can persist for some amount of time, but then it kind of tapers off and there's really not that much of it. So then you can kind of switch to your grass hay established. And keep adding those so you reach your rotation, your entire rotation year trajectory. Okay. So I have these entered in. I'm now going to look at the sheet that NRCD provided me with that has my Russell 2 values. Make sure that the value you're using is in fact the Russell 2 value and that it matches the year in rotation, right? So in a rotation with a corn silage with cover crop and hay, they're not all going to be the same. Your first year in corn after hay is going to look a little bit different than your second year in corn, or even your third year in hay is going to look a little bit different than your newly established hay field. I'm putting in random numbers here, so don't look at these and think that they have any real merit at all. Just want to kind of go through. So I just want to make sure that I've got my 10, I'm like 1, 2, 3, 4 of my corn, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, 7 of my hay established. I only wanted 6. If you accidentally put one in that you didn't need, you probably wouldn't have this Russell 2 value. But if you enter one that, again, you didn't need, you can get rid of it by just pressing this X button here. Another neat way that you can see if you have all the years in rotation that you're looking for is this current year in rotation. When you pick this now, we see all the years that we just entered. Screen a little bit. And I'm going to pick the one that this most represents. And in this example, I'm going to say that this is my, maybe my 3rd year in hay. And then I'm going to need the average Russell 2 soil loss. And that's going to be the average of these 10 values I just entered in this column. So the GoCrop does not calculate that for you. If you have all this information in a spreadsheet, you can create an average that way, or literally it's like sitting with your phone or calculator and entering them all in and, dividing by 10 or 8 or whatever number of rotation years you have to get the average, and you'll put that here. Again, I'm putting a random number in here. I'm not spending the time to make the average, but you should do that so your plan is in compliance. I'm just doing that in the interest of time. So now that I have this rotation, I can keep going on my merry way and continuing to add rotations to the rest of my fields. I am, however, going to go back to list view because this step, like some of our other steps, we have the option to copy and we have the option to bulk edit, right? So if I've got a list of fields here and I've, created this 10-year rotation in rectangle field, but it's the same, pretty much the same rotation with the same Russell 2 values. This is very important that you might also want the same Russell 2 values there, is that I want to copy my rectangle field to my square field. So I'm going to click my square field, I'm going to click copy. We get the same pop-up that we got in risk management where we can say we want to copy from the plan we're working in, copying to square field from our rectangle field, right? That's the one that we just completed. Let me know it's going to overwrite any of the information I already have there. That's okay. It's there. I'm going to click copy now. Now my square field is complete and it's got a similar soil type and management practices to my rectangle field. So if I feel like the Russell 2 values are all the same, but what is different in my example about my square field is that this isn't my first year. It's not my 7th year in the rotation. It's not my 3rd or 4th year in the West Legume hay. It's actually my 1st year in corn silage cover crop. So I'm just going to switch that up, but not, everything else is going to stay the same, but this is just got corn silage in my rotation here. So just kind of come back here, just like we talked about in risk management, this is another way if you've got, 3 or 4 fields that are all corn silage and have Russell 2 values, you can choose those fields. Also click edit, the bulk edit, and you can manipulate what the current year is in rotation and their average soil loss. But it will overwrite all of them at once. So if you have some fields that have the same information, you can use the bulk edit feature just like we did in risk management. It's always good practice when you're done to go through and double check that your corn or that your crop rotations match the fields that you're in. Quick glance and that your Russell 2s make sense. Like check your work. That's you're entering data. It's always important to check your data entries. All right, we just went over crop rotations and now we're going to wrap up with crops. We'll go on to the next step. Clicking crop, same layout, field name, track and field number, but now we have this none, and this none is saying you haven't entered any crops. And this is one of the features in GoCrop we want to expand to other steps as we can, but having more descriptions in this long row so you know a little bit more about your field before you click on it, which can be really helpful if you've got a bunch of fields and you want to filter them or anything else. So we're just going to start at the beginning with diamond field. We'll click there. No crops found, similar to what we saw when we have a soil test. We do have a new button up here, which is if you don't have any crops, you're not managing for any crops on this field, but you still want to keep it in your nutrient management plan. You can click no crops this year, and that will just tell GrowCrop that this is complete, but we don't have any crops to manage on it. But that's not the case for us because we've got a field that's got crops. We want to plan the nutrients for it. So I'm going to add a crop here, and now I'm going to choose my type. And I've got 2 options, annual or perennial. So your corn silage would be annual, your perennials would be your hay and your pasture, these types of things. Now we get to choose our crop. Very similar to rotations, but a little bit different, right? Like, because we're managing one single crop, it says corn silage. It doesn't say corn silage with cover crop. There's other ways to indicate that in your crop form. But just so you know, you're going to choose corn silage here. And there's a whole host of other crops you can choose from. We have this help text to help us answer some of these other questions here. So I'll just open this up a little bit. But we have some default values for surface cover percent. So for corn, that's about 15. And I know like late in the fall is like, or not even late in the fall, like late in the summer, it's canopied over a lot and it's got seems like a lot of surface coverage aerially, but it's also, that land has spent a lot of time not as covered. Like think about like it's, coming out when it's growing, it's like this big and it keeps, covering that surface slowly, little by little. So anyway, for 15 for row crops like corn silage, and then our legume content, we can leave it blank because it's corn silage, but if it's hay or pasture, we do need to enter 0, or we need to enter a legume content for that. In this case, for corn silage 0, I'm just going to enter it. And then we have these cultural practices. And this is a space where you can indicate, if it's corn silage, if it's in no-till practices or it's grown with cover crop. This grown with a nurse crop is really just for newly established hay or pasture fields. And then vining or high canopy or mulch or living row covered is really for vegetable production. So for most folks in Go Crop, they are going through nutrient management planning now. You might only be thinking about clicking no-till or grown with cover crop. And then we have these other options to help Go Crop best manage your crops when you update. So in general, if you're growing corn silage, hay, or pasture, you'll ignore these. If you are growing greens that overwinter or some other crops, these might be more applicable to you. Note that there is this option that says this is a cover crop. Even if you grow your corn silage with cover crop, it's not a cover crop, right? We've already indicated up here that it's grown with cover crop, and you've also indicated that in your rotation that it's grown with a cover crop. If you wanted to manage your cover crop as a crop, you could add it as a crop, but for the time being, just for the first time when you're making your nutrient management plan, most of your plans will only have one crop. And I would really strongly discourage anybody from adding another crop to their field that is a cover crop. It's accounted for in other ways. It doesn't need to have its own special management and will confuse things later on. If you have any questions about that, feel free to reach out. Happy to talk about it. Okay, click save here. And now I see this red. There's alarm bells. Something's wrong. What happened? I filled out my form completely. And part of that is because I filled out my details, but Go Crop needs more information about this crop, but I didn't have the ability to enter it before. And the information it needs is my corn silage yield and harvest plan. And because I don't have that, I can't get my corn silage recommendations, right? Or my crop recommendations, because crop recommendations are based off of your crop and also the yield. If we don't enter the yield, we don't have the crop recommendations. So because we don't have our yield information, we don't have our crop recommendation, and therefore the whole crop page is incomplete. So we're gonna fix that really soon. We're gonna click add, and then we're gonna fill out the information. So this total anticipated yield, in some ways, I feel like is really straightforward. It's typically how much do you get off of this field in an average year, right? Like, some years are gonna be really great, and unfortunately, some years are gonna be kind of crummy. And then you have like those average years. So that's what you would put here, right? So for corn silage, it might be something like 25 tons per acre. Now, that said, sometimes I'm talking to some producers and I'm like, they say, oh, I get like 15 tons per acre of corn off this field. And I say, okay, but like, if you fertilized it more, do you think it would realistically have a higher yield? We can look at soil tests, we can look at organic matter, we can look at some things and say, if it got more fertility, it might do better. It might be do like, 20 tons per acre or something like that. And then there's some other farmers I work with where I say 15 seems pretty low. Are you sure it's that low? And they say, oh yeah. Like just because of the way the soil type is, it's that's what it's capable of doing, right? So one thing to do is to think about what that field is producing and what it can produce on average, right? That said too, I could be talking with somebody who says, 25 tons, but if I really put 300 pounds of urea on it, I'm sure I could get 30. That's not the circumstance I'm talking about. I'm not talking about like if we put a ridiculous amount of fertilizer on there, we would get that a little bit of a bump. I'm really talking about like we've got a degraded field and we can build fertility in it, and that would increase its yields. So it's a little bit of a nuanced conversation. And again, I think anybody, we're happy to talk you through that if you have some questions about that. All right, so our next question is number of harvests for corn silage. You can leave it blank because it's 1, it's 0, it knows that. And then grazies is just here because it's always there. Again, it's corn silage, so we can ignore that. We click save. And now everything's green. Got the green light, we can continue on. That said, I think a couple of things that I do want to point out is that our corn silage recommendations are automatically generated, and our crop removal values are also automatically generated. And I know that GoCrop is using the book values, the automatically generated ones based off of I don't have it with me right in front of me, but the nutrient recommendations for field crops in Vermont. I know GoCrop is using that because it says book values. If you had a strong, compelling reason or evidence to change either of these, you can just by clicking on it, and you can override them. And if you do, that's what this looks like. It says complete. If I change book values here for crop removal, it would also say complete instead of book values. Please do not do that. I just wanted to show you that you can do it and what it looks like when you don't. But please don't do that. GoCrop is doing its best to make sure that your plan meets the 590 standard. This is one of the ways that it does that. So in the event that you got excited, you went in, you changed these things, to get them back to go to book values, you're going to open it up and you're just going to trash it. You're going to throw it away and like disregard that. So we'll click that little orange trash bin button in the bottom left. GoCrop's like, are you sure? You sure you want to delete this? I'm pretty confident. So I'm going to click delete. This is a bug. This crop form pops up. Just close it, move on, we'll fix it. And now we've got it back to book values. So everything's looking good there. While I'm thinking about it, I also think that it's really good practice that whenever you enter a crop here, you go back to crop rotation and make sure that the crop that you chose is the same crop that you have in your crop tab. You don't have to do this like one after the other. You can enter all your crops in and then go back and forth and check. But this is it's a really quick way just to oscillate back and forth, go back and forth between crops and crop rotations and make sure they match, right? My diamond field has got corn and crop rotations. I've got corn with cover crop. Looks good. I'm going to go back to my crop tab. Then I move on to my next field, which is my large pasture. I'm going to add my crop. My pasture is perennial, so I'll click perennial. I'll choose my crop here. Notice my options are a little bit different than they were in the rotation, right? Like I have hay, I have pasture. I don't have hay new, hay established. And I also don't have an option to choose like hay or pasture with legume. And that's because I get to choose what that is below, because there's a little bit more nuance there. For my pasture, my surface cover is going to be pretty high, and then my legume content in my pasture, I'm going to say is low, below 30. So I think one of the things that I want to pause and talk about a little bit is that legume content impacts nitrogen recommendations, and their thresholds are between like 0 and 30%, 30 and 60%, and greater than 60. So if you're sitting there thinking, is my pasture 15% or is it 20%? It doesn't matter all that much, but it does matter if it's more like 25 or 35, because those are two different thresholds. Or if it's 50 versus 65, again, two different thresholds, but thinking like, if it's 50, if it's 55%, that doesn't matter. And if you want to see what those thresholds are, like I know I'm verbally saying them, but there's a nice little table in the nutrient recommendations for field crops guidebook that'll show you what those are and maybe help you think about that a little bit. So for my perennial pasture, if I'm going to reseed it, I will use a cover crop, but I'm not going to no-till it. My pasture's not being reseeded this year, and I am going to harvest or graze it. And this reseeding button for pasture hay is important because, again, that's the difference between a new hay or pasture stand and an established hay or pasture stand, and the nitrogen recommendations are different for them. Feel good about this crop. I'm going to click save. Again, we got our big incomplete here. So I'm going to add my harvest plan here. And because I have a pasture, the recommendations are a lot more streamlined for pasture than they are for corn silage or even hay, partially because pasture's already in the recommendations at a pretty low nitrogen recommendation here, accounting for manure and urine deposition from your cows. So it's assuming that they're out there, that they're cycling nutrients. Some of the nutrients are coming in as forage, and some of the nutrients are coming out as waste. And waste, I mean like animal nutrients. So that's one thing to think about when you're looking at this. So I'm going to click our add for pasture yield and harvest plan. And for this, it's my pasture. And I'm going to say, on average, I get 2.5 tons per acre. And I can either enter number of harvests or number of grazes below. Save. And we're done with our large pasture. So now I'm going to move on to my crops and my rectangle field. And I'm just making this up. So I don't have years of history with rectangle field, and I forget what crop I said was going to go there. So I'm going to go back to my crop rotations, scroll down here, say, oh, it's established hay. Great. So now I'm going to come to my crop. I'm going to add it. I'm going to choose my crop type, perennial, and choose hay. I remember seeing in my rotation that it did have some legume content in this scenario. I would say 45, and I'm going to grow it with a cover crop. It was like my third or fourth year in the rotation, so I'm not reseeding. I'm going to click save. Oh, I said cover crop. See, this is my second one in here, but you can see how easily when you're like entering data, it's really easy to be like, oh yeah, automatic click, automatic click, automatic click. I'm not growing my hay crop with cover crop, but if I were to reseed it, I would grow it with a nurse crop. Oof. Changing that arrow right now, or that check mark. I'm gonna click save. And right now I need to enter my yield and harvest plan to generate my crop recommendations. So I'm gonna do that. And say, if you aren't quite sure what your hay yields are and the friendly PSA to be compliant with Vermont Institute of Agriculture required agricultural practices, you need to keep yields by field every single harvest. So for corn silage, it's once a year, but for hay, it could be 2 to 5 times a year. But in general, on average in Vermont, it's like 4 tons per acre. So, if you're like, think about that when I think I'm part of why I'm saying it like this is because also when we're putting in anticipated yield, we're putting it in as dry matter, right? So you might be taking it off the field and you're like, oh, I'm getting 6-7 tons per acre, but that might be a really wet crop. And on a dry matter basis, it might be more like 4 tons per acre. So in that sense, it's like, well, yep, my fields, I kept all of my records, but I don't necessarily know the dry matter. But on average, they're produced like any other hay field in Vermont, so that's typically 4. For hay, number of harvests, this does matter because it contributes to nitrogen recommendations. So in this example, let's say it's 4, and I'm going to click save. Now, here is one example where, depending on what you entered for your crop details and your yield and harvest plan, your hay recommendations might be a little bit different. And that's because your recommendations that you get on your soil test report is really like streamlining a bunch of variables into one bucket. And Go Crop is utilizing all the variables as the calculation is intended. I think all of this is to say that if you see nutrient recommendations on your soil test report from the University of Vermont's AETL lab, different from what Go Crop generates, they are using the same spreadsheet. It's just that the AETL is trying to simplify it, and that makes a ton of sense. In Go Crop, because it's all automated, it's a little bit more precise to what the original calculations are. I'm kind of happy to talk a little more through this if folks have questions, but that's all to say that you might see some book value recommendations that don't match the AETL responses. That's okay. That's okay. And just as a bit of a side, right, like my nitrogen recommendation is 40 pounds per acre here. And part of the reason that it's 40 pounds per acre is because my legume content is 45%. So if I dump this up to 75%, remember I told you there's a 60% threshold, and I click save, now I have 0. And that's because if you have a high legume content, if you add a lot of nitrogen, then it favors the grasses and it can decrease the legume content over time. So the recommendations are fertilizing to keep that legume crop going within that hay legume pasture stand. And so if I, had maybe more like a 50% legume content, my crop is going to need more legume or more nitrogen to meet the crop demands, right? And some of this too, I think Heather talked about this, is that legume crops form a symbiotic relationship with rhizobia, and so they're fixing nitrogen, and so the grass benefits from that, and that's why you don't need as much either. So I've got one more field, and I'll come back to my list view because I also want to show you that we have these other options, right, where I can copy from one field to another. So for example, I'm going to look at my square field, my crop rotation, and I said that I had corn silage cover crops, and maybe my crop details in my square field are the same as they were for my diamond field. So just like I was looking at beforehand, I want to copy to my square field from this plan, from my diamond field. And it doesn't recognize that I have that crop there. So apparently we just found a bug, can't copy this. Oh, sorry. Here's the boo-boo, right? Is that I missed, because I'm on default mode, that the crops that I, from this dropdown, say perennial and overwintered crop, but if I choose to all crops, right, that key dropdown, then Go Crop says, oh, there are other crops in my diamond field. It's not just perennial and overwintered. I can actually copy that corn crop over. So now I'm going to click copy now. All right, and now it says it's complete. My square field copied over that corn silage information. I know that I'm a little bit past time, but the one other thing that I wanted to talk about, I don't have this rotation example exactly. Oh, yes, I do actually. So in some cases, right, I'm planning in 2026 that my main crop is going to be corn silage, like that's what my rotation is. But also, I'm not going to plant that till like maybe or end of May or early June. I'm going to try to get a first cut off of hay before I plant my corn silage. And if you want to capture that, you can add it as a crop. Choose perennial, choose our hay, our surface cover percent, our legume percent, and all that other good stuff. Save that here. And now we'll add our yield and harvest plan. Now in a typical year, right, my hay might get 4 tons per acre, but this year I'm only gonna get maybe 1.5. So I'm just taking that one cut, just that one harvest. And maybe, so now I've got all that stuff filled in, my hay recommendations and hay crop removal. And maybe because I'm planting corn silage a little bit late, or whatever other reason I have, maybe even like in the following year, my corn silage might get 25 tons per acre because I'm planting a different variety or something. But I might want to drop that down a little bit, depending on if that makes sense. So one of the examples that I most frequently see two crops in Go Crop is when someone is rotating from hay to corn and they're going to take a first cut off of the hay field before they plant their corn silage. The one example I haven't really gone over today, but is really important, is if you're rotating the other way, if you're going from annual production to hay production. The one thing to keep in mind there is, you fill all the stuff out the same, but you're going to click reseeding this year. Because this is a new plan, you don't need to think about this, but I'm going to say it now, so hopefully it's planting the seed later, that when you update and you copy your crops over from one year to the other, it's still going to, like if you chose in one of your fields that you're reseeding this year, it's going to carry that over. So you're going to want to check all your crops and you'd want to uncheck that. I think the one other thing I would recommend before I stop talking is to also check, right, we went back and forth between our crops and our crop rotations to make sure that like those matched up, which is great. But the other thing to check too is between your crops and your risk management, and that if it has living vegetation in April too, right? So, my crop here for my square field for my risk management, I had put no, but in fact, yes, it does, because it has that one hay crop that I'm going to be, that will be there in the spring. So it's just another thing to check as you go through. My rectangle field, my crop is hay, and my risk management, I put no, so I'm going to put yes. In my crop, in my large pasture, my risk management, that's good. In my diamond field, I have yes, because I have that with cover crop on it. I realized this time I didn't pause in between steps. I just kept on going. So I'm sorry if folks had questions and I missed them, but I'm happy to take any now or stay on as people work in their plan. And Susan, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and you can please stop recording.